Okay, let's just dive right into this. When we think of Dunkirk, we almost immediately picture that famous Dunkirk spirit, right? That incredible triumph of unity snatched right out of the jaws of a totally catastrophic military defeat. But in this explainer, we're actually going to strip away that polished myth. We're going to plunge directly into the chaotic, messy, and honestly incredibly fascinating reality of May 31st, 1940. We're talking the micro-stories of the little ships, the absolute logistical nightmares unfolding on the beaches, and ultimately how all of this ties into a much broader psychological battle for civilian morale. Let's get into it. Picture this. You're standing on the docks at Ramsgate Harbor in England. A tiny, completely battered civilian yacht pulls up, and as troops just continuously pour out of it, a bewildered chief petty officer who's tallying the men ashore literally can't believe his eyes. He looks at the captain and utters these exact words. "My God, mate, where did you put them?"
Well, that captain was C.H. Lightoller, and if that name is ringing a bell for you, it's because almost 30 years prior, he was the second officer on the RMS Titanic. He was actually the most senior officer to survive her sinking. Now, cut to 1940, he's a civilian, and he's captaining his personal 58-foot motor yacht, the Sundowner. When the Admiralty asked him to hand his boat over to a naval crew for the evacuation, Lightoller flat out refused, basically told them if his boat was going into a war zone, he and his son were taking it themselves.
To really wrap your head around the sheer, unbelievable scale of what Lightoller pulled off, just consider the number 130. He managed to cram 130 men onto a boat that was built to comfortably hold maybe 21 people. I mean, he packed 75 men below deck until they practically couldn't breathe, but the rest on top and dodged enemy aircraft fire the entire way back across the English Channel. And he did it by using evasive maneuvers he just learned from his youngest son who was in the Air Force. Truly wild stuff.
Section 1. The Little Ship's Sail, Navigating the English Channel.
So, it's the morning of Friday, May 31st. Ordinary sailors, guys like able seaman Sam Palmer, woke up in places like the Merry England Pavilion at Ramsgate Harbor. And when they stepped outside, they witnessed something completely unprecedented, a massive gathering of civilian ships. The small vessel's pool had literally been requisitioning anything and everything that could float.
Now, Palmer and his crew were assigned two tiny motor yachts, the Naiad Errant and the Westerly. Palmer chose to captain the Naiad Errant, and the reason why is super important. While it was slightly larger at 32 feet, it crucially featured an open rear cockpit, a tiny dinghy, and a sturdy boarding ladder. You see, in the shallow, incredibly chaotic surf of Dunkirk, a boarding ladder wasn't just some luxury add-on. It was absolutely the difference between being able to pull a drowning, exhausted soldier out of the water or having to watch them slip away.
Section 2. Chaos on the Coast. The Logistics of Evacuation.
The success of this whole evacuation really hinged on this massive underlying tension between strict military obedience and civilian initiative. Take the diverging fates of two Southern Railway sister ships, the Hive and the Whitstable. Captain Baxter of the Whitstable followed his military orders to the letter. He anchored off Beach 2, waited for small boats to bring the troops out to him, and the boats just never came. He ended up leaving with only 14 men on a ship meant to hold hundreds. On the flip side, you have Captain Morford of the Hive. He arrived at his designated beach, quickly realized no troops could reach him, and completely ignored his orders. He used his own initiative, drove his massive ferry directly into Dunkirk Harbor right under heavy artillery fire, and managed to rescue 650 troops.
To understand why Captain Morford's massive gamble actually paid off, you have to picture the geography of the area. There were 3 designated evacuation beaches, spreading out east into Belgium. But the water there was so shallow that large transport ships couldn't even get close to the shore. What they desperately needed were the east and west moles, these long stone and wooden breakwaters that extended way out into the deep water of the harbor. If you could manage to dock at the mole, exactly like Morford did, you could load hundreds of men in a matter of minutes. But if you just waited off the beaches, you were entirely at the mercy of those little boats. And honestly, on Friday, May 31st, relying on those little boats was just a total disaster. Here's exactly why those transport ships sat offshore completely empty while soldiers were hopelessly stranded on the beach. First off, the wind shifted, churning up this rough onshore surf that swamped what little boats they had. Second, there was a severe lack of small craft to begin with. Third, and this is a detail that blows my mind, the average infantry soldier had absolutely zero idea how to row a boat. Couple all of that with profound starvation, total physical exhaustion, and a complete lack of leadership ensuring the few boats that made it out to the ships were actually rowed back to the beach, and you've got a perfect recipe for logistical paralysis.
Section 3. The Shrinking Perimeter. The trap closes.
Let's zoom out for a second. On Sunday, May 26th, the initial strategic situation actually looks somewhat manageable. The Allies had a relatively wide escape corridor to the coast. We're talking about 60 miles wide.
But man, things change fast in war. Just 2 days later, by Tuesday the 28th, the speed of the German advance had entirely severed that corridor. They sliced right through the Allied lines, trapping this massive pocket of French forces inland around Lille, completely cutting them off from the sea.
And by the end of the week, the pocket had practically collapsed. The Allies were pushed into an incredibly tight, highly vulnerable perimeter, quite literally with their backs to the sea.
The Germans obviously knew exactly how dire this was for the Allies, and they weaponized that knowledge. They started dropping propaganda leaflets directly onto the trapped soldiers, including this map that showed their surrounded position, with the taunt, "The game is up, the innings is over." It was a highly calculated psychological attack designed to completely crush the morale of the British and French forces. Fortunately, though, most of the soldiers just ended up using the leaflets for toilet paper.
But the chaos wasn't just happening in the mud and the sand. It was causing immense friction at the very highest levels of government. Just consider the absolutely circuitous flight path Winston Churchill had to take that very same Friday just to meet with French leaders in Paris.
The reality was, Churchill couldn't just hop over the channel to Paris. The Luftwaffe had complete control of the skies to the north. So instead, his unarmed Flamingo aircraft had to take this ridiculous 450-mile detour. They take off from Hendon, meet up with a fighter escort over Weymouth, fly way out west over the Channel Islands, and finally have to sneak into Paris from the south. It took 2.5 hours, literally doubling the normal flight time, just to hold a single political meeting.
Section 4. The Truth About Morale, Examining the Historical Consensus.
So, what actually is civilian morale? Essentially, it's the state of mind and behavior of the public when they are placed under the immense stress of war. And governments track this metric obsessively. Why? Because in a modern, democratic, total war, if you don't have the psychological commitment and the social solidarity of the regular people, the ones building the planes and rationing the food, you lose. It is literally that simple.
To really get this, we have to look past that polished post-war mythology and dig into works like Robert Mackay's Half the Battle, which deeply analyzes what civilian morale in Britain actually looked like.
Mackay dives right into this fierce historical tug-of-war. See, for decades, we had the myth of the Blitz, this really rosy idea that everyone was just perfectly unified, cheerful, and brave all the time. But then, revisionist historians, sometimes called the apathy school, came along and swung the pendulum entirely the other way. They pointed out, hey, there was actually looting, panic, class conflict, and bigotry happening. But Mackay, he takes a counter-revisionist approach. He argues that sure, the revisionists are right that things weren't perfect, but the core of that original myth is actually true. Yes, there were definitely wobbles, but overall, morale stayed incredibly firm. The government eventually learned that heavy-handed propaganda just didn't work. What actually kept morale high was a sense of fairness, maintaining small, ordinary comforts, and the genuine promise of post-war social improvement.
Section 5. The Legacy of Dunkirk, Beyond the Beaches.
Those incredible micro-stories we started with, like Lytler refusing to give up his tiny yacht, or Sam Palmer specifically choosing the boat with the best ladder, those weren't just neat little military footnotes. This mass civilian participation became the defining emblem of British national identity. It fundamentally cemented a psychological bond between the state and its people. It proved to the government that they could actually trust ordinary citizens in a crisis, completely validating that high civilian morale Mackay wrote about.
Which brings us to a pretty big final thought. George Orwell once hinted at this invisible chain that bound the whole nation together. When we look at the sheer logistical impossibility of Dunkirk and the fact that a fractured, totally exhausted nation somehow managed to pull together to achieve it, it leaves us with a really profound question. Was the true battleground of the Second World War not just on the beaches of France, but fundamentally within the minds, the resilience, and the morale of the civilian population? Really think about that as you consider how history is made. It's not just generals moving pieces on maps, it's ordinary people making extraordinary choices. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the history you think you know.